Hey, welcome to Lecture 5, everyone, and more specifically, welcome to my kid's hockey practice, because that's where I have to film it today. So he's out there somewhere in White, not really sure. They actually practice at the same facility that the Carolina Hurricanes use, which is kind of cool, because 2 weeks ago, the Hurricanes actually took the ice after they did, so they all thought that was pretty neat there. Lecture 5, to get back to what's important here, deals with the legislature. So specifically, we're talking about Congress here, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So Article 1 of the Constitution, as we discussed, basically says you need a Congress. So if you find yourself like I do thinking, do we really need a Congress? Maybe we don't. Maybe we just get rid of it. The Constitution says we have to have one. More specifically, it says it has to be a bicameral legislature. And what that means is that it needs 2 chambers. And so that's how we end up with the 2 chambers of Congress. The lower chamber, the House of Representatives, comprised of 435 members. The upper chamber, the Senate, 100 members here. This idea of a bicameral legislature actually comes from the British parliamentary system, where you have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Beyond that, doesn't actually have a lot in common with that system, other than just the general organizational structure. We're going to talk about, particularly on the next slide, sort of the powers of Congress here. Principally, it's to create the laws of the land. They're the legislative branch. They are tasked with making laws. They also serve an important sort of check and balance against the other branches of government here, and we'll talk about on that next slide. But Congress also has what we refer to as the power of the purse, meaning that Congress controls the budget, so even if the president wants to institute certain programs or plans, he or she is dependent upon Congress to actually approve the spending for that. So we've talked a little bit about this separation of power, and it's in practice, when it works, it's actually a really smart and effective system here. So Congress can create the laws, and only Congress can create laws, with a big asterisk there, because you've got executive orders, which we'll talk about here in 2 weeks. The executive and judicial branches can stop congressional legislation. So both those branches have essentially checks on Congress. Obviously, the president, and we'll talk about the power of the veto, so the president can veto legislation that he or she doesn't approve of, and the Supreme Court or the federal court system can decide that laws passed by Congress are unconstitutional, and they have in quite a few instances there. Congress, on the other hand, has the power of the budget and the control over the budget, which I mentioned, which allows them to withhold funds for certain presidential priorities. They also serve to check the Supreme Court in sort of an indirect way, in the sense that, as I think we mentioned briefly at one point in the class, presidential appointees to federal judicial positions have to be approved by a majority in the Senate. So that's one area where Congress is actually able to exert some control over both the president and the federal court system. So let's start by talking about the House of Representatives here. So the lower chamber, Congress is known as the House. It's comprised of 435 members. That 435 number is actually set by law. It would increase, I think I mentioned DC statehood previously. It would go up to 436. DC would get a member in the House, a voting member. If it is, in fact, granted statehood. With Republicans control the House, it's probably not going to happen, at least in this Congress here. Each state's congressional district or number of representatives they have are essentially equal to the proportion of that state's population, as determined by the decennial census. So every 10 years, we do the census, we count how many people live in any state, and then we apportion those 435 House seats based on population. So you can see on the map there sort of how it's divvied up. California is currently the most populous state in the union, so they have the most House districts. They have 53 seats in the House. You can see some other ones there. North Carolina has 13 members there. There's, according to this, no change, but I got to make sure that this is the most recent one, because I feel like I can't recall. I thought there was a change here, but I can't remember. Maybe this is another slide. But you can see, based on population and demographic trends, how this changes. So Texas has gained a large population over the last 10 years. A lot of that was driven by inexpensive housing prices. Was for a long time very cheap to own a house in Texas. I know this because every dumbass I went to high school with lives on like 10 acres and a giant 4,000 square foot ranch home on their salary as a whatever they do. Not envious at all. I think that's sort of changed over time as more people have moved to Texas. Similar to the Raleigh Durham market, they've driven up housing prices there. So you can see that there's been a population exodus from certain states. New York, for instance, still has 27 House seats, but that's actually down from previous. In fact, they lost 2 House seats. So a lot of that, my line of business, we track migration, like intra-U.S. migration. We've got people leaving high tax states such as New York and Massachusetts, moving to the South. The U.S. South has seen, really over the kind of last 20 years, but has really ramped up in the last 10, a large population increase, and a lot of it's due to cost of living. What else do I have here? So you see several small states. I'll point out that Montana, for instance, is a very large geographically a very large state, but they have a very small population. So they only actually have 1 House district. See North Dakota, South Dakota in the same situation. So let's go back for a minute to the Constitution here and the ideas behind the House of Representatives. So the House was always sort of conceived as being the portion of Congress that represents the will of the public or the people. This apportion by population plan was favored in northern states because they had a lot of large, dense urban areas here. In the South, it was very much opposed because if you think about some of these southern states, particularly at the time, this was before the exodus to the South because air conditioning wasn't a thing. Very small populations, very agrarian economies, so small populations spread out over a large area. So the House apportionment system, as it was originally drafted, really benefited northern states. Like, you've got big populations, we'll take that. Historically, the House has been seen as the less sophisticated, less formal of the 2 chambers. Obviously, with 435 members, it's not as collegial. It's a large institution here. You hear a lot of craziness that comes out of House members increasingly over time. We have some members on both, in both parties who've, sort of established brands, and those brands are crazy. Still nothing compared to state legislatures, which are just nuts and insane. I'll talk about that later here. But these House members serve 2-year terms, so they're up for re-election every 2 years, which means they're kind of constantly running for re-election. And that was on purpose. That was to make them very subject to the will of the people. So if they did things that the public didn't like, every 2 years, the public would have a chance to essentially fire them. So let's talk about the creation of House districts. So it's federal law that dictates how many congressional districts or seats a state will have, but it actually falls to the state legislatures to decide how those are apportioned. And this becomes critically important. There's probably actually nothing that explains the current state of U.S. politics more than the congressional redistricting and gerrymandering here. So every 10 years, states are tasked with basically recreating their congressional districts here. In practice, the political party that's in power in the state legislature has the power to draw these lines because when it goes to a vote to approve these, they're going to have the majority in the legislature to do so. And so in practice, what they do is they draw congressional districts that politically benefit them and maximize their party's representation in the state. So in the state of North Carolina, for instance, the legislature has been controlled by Republicans for at least the last 2 instances, the last 2 censuses or times when these districts were created here. And as a result, the congressional districts that we have in the state of North Carolina very much provide an advantage to Republicans in the state. This process of politically drawing these political lines to the advantage of your party is known as gerrymandering. It so happens that North Carolina is actually sort of ground zero for a debate over the legality or the constitutionality of gerrymandering. It will drive home the point that Republicans tend to have more support at the state level. A lot of it has to do with state politics and the relatively greater power that rural areas have than urban areas in a lot of states. But certainly in cases where Democrats have control of drawing the maps, they do the same thing. Let's talk a little bit deeper about gerrymandering in North Carolina. So this is fascinating. This is something I've been familiar with and known about since even before I lived in North Carolina here. In 2011, the congressional district map was redesigned after the census by North Carolina Republicans, and it was highly criticized by Democrats as unduly gerrymandering based on race. Eventually, this was struck down. So what you see on the right there is the congressional district in question here. that Republicans created in 2011, it was designed to basically take a large population of African American voters and put them into one congressional district, and they did it in a very wonky way. They created this district that basically encapsulated, the principally African American areas of Charlotte, a very narrow line going north up to Winston-Salem, where it grabbed a large African American population there. Greensboro, same thing, and then basically sort of went around Durham there. This was District 2. Can you imagine if you were the representative from that district? You've got to put an office somewhere, and you've got to be responsible for traveling around that district that spans from Charlotte to Durham, representing people here. This was actually struck down by the Supreme Court. They decided that all those states had the reserve power to delineate what congressional districts would look like, but doing so based on race would be a violation of the 14th Amendment, and so it became the law of the land that you can't draw a congressional district based principally on race moving forward here. The 2020 census, North Carolina, I knew they gained one House seat, so that map I used must have been old. This has led to redrawing of district lines, and again, we're seeing this being challenged by the court system here. It gets very tricky because obviously race and political preference are very highly correlated in the United States. So it's very difficult to sort of differentiate or delineate when something was done for political gain, which the court is fine with, and when it's done based on a race. Obviously, from the perspective of African Americans, the challenge here is that, if you put a larger than the actual population of percentage of African Americans in one congressional district, then their power or influence is basically concentrated in one district versus being spread out over many districts where they could potentially exert more political influence. Let's shift and talk about House leadership for a minute here. So the political party that holds a majority of the seats in the House of Representatives is allowed to select essentially the Speaker of the House. Or the Speaker of the House typically comes from their party. And now doesn't have to be the case. In fact, we had this very interesting situation here recently where Kevin McCarthy, who was eventually selected as the Speaker of the House, was struggling to get the votes. Democrats were voting for their selection, the person who they didn't think was actually going to win. At some point, it was discussed, would there be a situation where the House, because the House gets to dictate its own rules, could say we're going to move to whoever has the most vote system, in which you could have a House majority or a Republican majority in the House and a Democratic Speaker. That's never happened. This is probably the closest we ever heard to it happening. Eventually, after it was like 14 votes or something, Kevin McCarthy was actually selected, so he's the Speaker of the House here. The majority party also gets to choose committee leadership roles and generally maintains, majority of members within each committee. So on the next slide, we'll talk about committees here, but that's very important because legislation has to first go through a committee before it can make it to the House floor. If you give yourself an advantage in that committee, then your party has essentially more power in that process. For the previous 117th Congress, Democrats had control of the House of Representatives, and so the committees were a majority Democratic members here. Additional leaders, and there are many here, majority and minority leaders and whips who are passed. The whips essentially guide partisan strategies, so they would be the ones that sort of coordinate with members of their political party to make sure that everybody's sort of voting based on the party's preferences. So I mentioned committees here. So before a bill can become law, it's got to be voted on by a committee. Committee assignments are actually incredibly important to House members. This is where they exert a lot of their power and influence. It's where they do a lot of the stuff that they can go back to their district and say, this is what I've done for you, please vote for me again here. Established members in good standing with their party often receive the best committee assignments. And so, and you can see a list on the right, sort of what are perceived as the most valuable committees to be a part of. Appropriations is always the top one because that's who delineates how your taxes are spent. So one thing that members of Congress, love to do to get reelected is, bring federal spending to their district. It's the reason you have, naval bases in, landlocked areas of the country, or, why is our strategic B-52 fleet of bombers in Shreveport, Louisiana? This is because of the congressional influence and power that came from that district there. You see a few others: Energy and Commerce, Ways and Means, which essentially decides the rules of Congress there. You can go down the list, and if you're a junior member of Congress, you just got elected, you're not particularly well known or well liked, you could be on the committee that decides, what's being served in the congressional cafeteria or something. I don't know if that's a real one, but it might be. So committee assignments here are very important. Also, members tend to like to be on committees that are relevant to their district, right? So if you have a military base in your district, you're going to want to be on the defense committee. Of course, like everything, this is a very political process. We just saw, recently in the news, Republicans have been kicking some Democratic members off of certain committees based on their dislike of them. Democrats did similar things. During the last Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene was stripped of committee assignments for some of the things that she had said. The legislative process in the House. So a potential bill must be introduced by a House member or senator. In the House, it must be taken to a committee, must be passed by the committee, and be successfully placed on a House calendar in order to proceed. So there's various steps, and a lot of legislation dies along the ways, and it's sort of purposely complicated so that we limit what Congress has to sort of vote on or sort of think on. Once on the floor, the prospective bill is debated, amended, and finally voted on. So if you have access to C-SPAN, you can sort of see this. If you're having trouble sleeping, find a replay of a congressional vote on C-SPAN there. That might help. And it just needs a simple majority vote before sending it to the Senate for consideration. So we'll talk about here in a second the process by which the House and the Senate have to compromise, and they have to create essentially one piece of legislation between the two chambers to take care of the president. Okay, so the Ducks here, he says, so if the majority party can simply vote for what they want, does that mean the minority party is essentially useless? No, that's not the case at all. So, look, a lot of the legislation that we hear about is high-profile stuff, and a lot of that is voted along party lines, in which case partisan control over Congress matters a lot. But a lot of the day-to-day legislation that Congress deals with is considerably less partisan. In fact, when the cameras are turned off, things actually members get a little bit more cooperative than you would otherwise think, or that they sort of portray. So congressional members often we call it working across the aisle to support the legislative priorities of members from the opposing party, and there's considerable evidence that they do so in strategic ways. So kind of quid pro quo, I'll vote for your legislation if you support me on this other thing here. Obviously, you have, although not as many as in the past, political moderates or partisan moderates, Republicans and Democrats who don't necessarily vote along party lines all the time there. They're very important in the legislative process because in times such as these, when you have a very small separation between power between the two political parties, these moderates who can potentially switch sides are very critical to getting legislation sort of passed or to the president. So let's switch to the Senate here. So a bill that is passed by the House must be approved by the Senate before it can be sent along to the president. The Senate is comprised of 100 members. And how that 100 comes about is essentially 2 from each state. So we talked about how the southern states didn't like this proportionate system that we created for the House. The solution to this was to create, obviously, the Senate and make it to where each state had equal representation. So even though California has a much, much, much larger population than Montana, in the Senate they both have equal representation. They both have 2 senators. The framers of the Constitution had intended for Senate to represent the will of the elites, and that's one of the things that's actually changed. And I talked about this when we talked about the amendments here. So the 17th Amendment in 1912 essentially changed the selection of senators from being the power of state legislators. So the state legislatures that would vote for the members of the Senate, and that was designed to keep, basically the public sort of some distance from the Senate. After 1912, we now directly vote for our members of the Senate. So that system went away as a result of that. Just thinking high level about some of the ideas behind the Senate here, the Connecticut Compromise was the specific compromise that created this chamber where each state essentially had equal power. The Senate is generally seen as more prestigious and reasoned of the 2 chambers. Think of it as I always use the example. I always call state legislatures, I always refer to them as Waffle Houses. So what's a little bit better than a Waffle House? We'll say an IHOP. So the House is IHOP, and the Senate is Applebee's. So slightly better. The Senate terms are 6 years. So again, the Senate was designed to where they didn't have to worry so much about being subject to public will because, if they do something over a 6-year period is a good possibility people are going to forget. Historically, the Senate has been more collegial than the House of Representatives. Senators have been more likely to be political moderates and to work across the aisle than House members, and that has always sort of countered the House of Representatives. We have found, and political scientists have noted, that the Senate is becoming more partisan over time, still less so than the House of Representatives. Consistent with its elevated status, it's the Senate that's responsible for confirming federal appointees. So obviously we saw this in the most recent Supreme Court selection process, where Joe Biden selected Ketanji Brown Jackson, and the Senate approved her appointment. The Senate receives bills passed by the House, and vice versa. So you can have Senate bills that then go to the House. So it actually goes both directions here. But the Senate is going to review and confer over anything the House sends them, because they have to agree on the language of the bill. So it has to be one bill that goes to the president that both the House and the Senate have voted on and agreed on. It has to go to what's known as a conference committee before that's established. So basically, you have these temporary committees that are, comprised of members of both the House and the Senate. And I will test you on, I always include a test question on this. Comprised of both members of both parties here, to basically create one single piece of legislation that can go to the president. Once the House and Senate agree to this language and both approve the bill, then it goes to the president for his or her approval. As we'll talk about when we talk about the president can sign that legislation. The president can veto that legislation, or the president can veto it and Congress can override it. We'll talk all about that all in a couple weeks. So just here again to summarize the differences between the House and Senate, because this is important to note here. The Senate's comprised of 100 seats. Each state gets 2 seats. There are 435 seats in Congress. Those seats are delineated by population, and then the state legislatures decide how to create those congressional districts. If you see on the map on the far right there, the reason they're not, those congressional districts aren't drawn in very, easy to understand ways, similar to like counties. This is because of gerrymandering, because they use that power to essentially create districts that give them benefit. A 6-year term in the Senate gives them more time for developing policy preferences, subjects them to less public scrutiny than a House member who's sort of constantly running kind of every 2 years there. One of the things that we talk about in elections is the incumbency effect. So even though members of the House are elected every 2 years, it's around 96% that are re-elected. So re-election rates for the Senate and the House are pretty much more or less the same. They're extremely high. Obviously, that impacts the extent to which the public actually really has a say if we keep sort of re-electing the same people. Let's talk a little bit about the composition of Congress here. And we'll start with race. So, look, critics of Congress have long said, and for most of U.S. history, it has been a largely white male institution, and more specifically, white male lawyers. So, naturally, in a world where roughly half our population is female, women, have pointed at and said, hey, what is our representation in this Congress? Obviously, on racial grounds as well, right? So if you look currently, fortunately, things are moving towards better representation. So African Americans, for instance, in the 118th Congress that just started, are now 11% of the combined House and Senate, and that's compared to about 14% of the U.S. population at large. So they've actually almost reached true representation in those chambers there. Latino Hispanics have a little bit more ways to go here, comprise 19% of the population, but they're only about 10% of Congress. This, again, has actually grown. So in the 118th Congress, it's actually grown considerably, which you can see versus the 117th that we just came from. The House is quite a bit more ethnically diverse in the Senate, which is 88% Caucasian. The Senate is compared to 61% of the population at large. All told, if you look at all 535 members of Congress, about 80% is Caucasian. So again, that's an advantage over the 61% Caucasian population in the U.S. at large. If we look at gender and sexual orientation here, so women have made, made great headway in sort of growing their representation in Congress. So currently with the new Congress, women are 28% of Congress. Again, they're 51% of the population. Fun fact, I don't know if I mentioned this before, when people ask, why are there more women in the U.S. than men, it's because we die sooner. So if you get into the higher age groups, 75 and older, there's actually a pretty decent gender split because women are more likely to still be alive. Men are 72% of Congress, you see there. But this has actually grown considerably. I don't have trend data here to show you, but I believe women were 26% of the last Congress. So it's moving in the right direction for those who advocate for, more equal representation there. One of the other sort of signs of progress can be found in the LGBT community here. So, if you look at that trend graph there, you can see we have 13 members of Congress that identify as LGBT. That's up from 11 in the previous Congress. And obviously, there's some historical sort of context here because, there were probably more LGBT members, sort of in the period kind of prior to, when it's more socially acceptable for people to come out. And so who knows what that sort of true number is there, but we're in a place now where these members feel comfortable identifying themselves based on their actual beliefs, and their representation has grown, sort of as a result of, obviously that becoming less of an impediment to running for Congress. All right, so the duck's back here. It says, isn't it a stretch to suggest that because someone identifies with a group that they automatically represent that group's interest? This is a very critical point here. So possibly advocates who suggest that women should represent 50% of Congress are calling for what's known as descriptive representation. So if I believe that women are half the population, they should be half of Congress. That's a descriptive model of representation, saying that they should have equal share. This differs from something that's a little bit more complex that we refer to as substantive representation. Substantive representation is where a person behaves in a way that is deemly representative into some specific group. So, good example I always come back to is Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court, right? Historically, there's been very few African American members of the U.S. Supreme Court, so naturally his appointment by Ronald Reagan was championed as a move towards more descriptive representation. The challenge is that Clarence Thomas is, political rulings or judicial rulings and political beliefs are very misaligned with the average African American voter. So, there would be people that would naturally say, well, yeah, he identifies as black, but is that really doing anything for me? Same thing on the female representation front. So if we have members of Congress who are female, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to vote based on the preferences of the collective preferences of female voters. We certainly saw this, with regard to Roe v. Wade and abortion legislation that sort of followed. It hasn't been, obviously defaulted that women support abortion rights, right? Even though if you poll U.S. women at large, they're going to be more supportive of abortion rights, at least when compared to men. So, very important distinction there to know that just because somebody, looks like a certain population or belongs to a certain population, doesn't necessarily mean that their actions are going to be reflective of the preferences of that group. Let's talk about models of representation here. There's three models that kind of seek to explain how members of Congress vote. The delegate model says that a member is cast with directly degrading the political preferences and beliefs of their constituents. So under the delegate model, you could have a member of Congress that says, look, I don't agree with how I'm voting, but the vast majority of my constituents do. So I'm going to vote with them and sort of trust their preferences here. That's in distinction, that's distinct from the trustee model. So a trustee model is where members, use their best judgment, and they see voting as, my constituents have selected me to make decisions for them. I have best access to the information. I know things that they don't necessarily know because I'm in these committee meetings. So even though the public may not agree with this decision, they trusted me to make one that's truly what's best for them. So that's where you'll see members of Congress that go against their constituents. Obviously, if you have higher levels of support, you're able to do that. A member who might be up for a tight re-election may be less likely to incorporate that model. In practice, what we find is that members of Congress follow what we call the political model, which is kind of a hybrid of both. So on legislation that is going to be highly visible, that voters are going to know how you voted, they're probably more likely to follow a delegate model. For some of the day-to-day things that don't get a lot of press or attention, they may be relying on a trustee model. So there's this question of what makes someone run for Congress here, and we call this candidate emergence. And I know this because one of my advisors, undergrad advisors, ended up being one of the leading researchers on trying to understand who runs for Congress and what are the factors that they can sort of consider when running here. So some of the things I identified: chance of winning. So potential candidates are most concerned with whether they can reasonably win. I mentioned previously the incumbency effect makes it very difficult for challengers to come in and win. If 96% of members of Congress are re-elected, then it's very difficult. One of my friends, actually from back in Florida, ran for Congress. He won the Democratic nomination for a district that had basically been redrawn as a result of the apportionment of funds. So basically, it was a new district that was created, so there wasn't an incumbent. He actually lost the general election to the Republican candidate this past November there, but he, in that situation, had a good chance of winning, and he actually came very close because there wasn't an incumbent in the race that he was running against. Obviously, the cost of running is important. So we think of these costs both financial and personal. And I can tell you from my friend Eric, it took a lot out of his family. Constantly campaigning. That is a 24-hour job when you're running for Congress there, and you're subjected to a lot of attention. And we all know that politics right now there's as much vitriol and animosity as there's been in recent history here. So certainly when he has young kids, his daughter was a classmate of my son, and I'm sure it's not easy, hearing things said about your father and that sort of thing. And obviously, these members invest a lot of their own personal money, or maybe they have to quit their day-to-day job or cut back to be able to do this. Masculinity has an effect here. So studies have shown that candidates, even women that demonstrate greater perceived masculinity, are more likely to be recruited for public office. And so, particularly at the federal level, I talked a little bit about sort of gender bias and candidate preference and selection, previously. So if you look at a lot of the women that have been successful in the federal government, they either were childless or their children had grown up and left the home. Hillary Clinton's a good example. One daughter who was an adult by the time she started her sort of own political aspirations. Elizabeth Dole was a great example of this, sort of in the 1980s and 1990s. Her and Bob Dole, her husband, didn't have children, so that made it easier for her. And so political scientists have really sort of explored this, and they've identified masculinity as a character trait that draws candidates to feel like they're more likely to win. And then at the end of the day, too, there needs to be a sense of purpose in serving in public office. So most of the candidates that run have some issue or something that they're very passionate about, and that drives them to want to, or at least feel like they're doing the public some good. So what actually motivates the actions of members of Congress? What do members of Congress want? When it boils down to it, it's survival. So first and foremost, members of Congress want to survive. They want to be reelected here. Political scientists have spent countless hours and whatnot investigating what drives these members. And at the end of the day, it's being able to survive, or in some cases being able to advance. They're concerned with their own reelection. None of their sort of goals can be attained unless they're actually in the seat. So that's why you see compromises. That's why you see this political model of power and voting. It's because sometimes you got to give up your preferences to stay in the office, otherwise you're not going to accomplish anything. And we would generally consider that a kind of a rational choice model, right? To where it makes sense that people are going to do things to stay reelected because you can't do any things you want to unless you're kind of in the seat. I use the example here. Hillbilly Elegy was a book, a New York Times bestseller that was written by J.D. Vance, who actually won his Senate race. He was heavily criticized, and I don't mind picking on J.D. Vance because I actually really enjoyed his book. My father's family had very much the same sort of background as his family described. Kind of Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia. People living in those areas and then facing sort of economic hardships. That was where my father's family had sort of originated from. And he as a person, as he sort of, after he wrote that book and he was doing speaking engagements and stuff, you get a very clear impression of sort of where he was politically, socially, conservative leaning. But then when he ran for Senate, you started seeing these tweets and other things that just didn't match up with any of that. And that made sense, right? Because he was trying to win over a populist base of voters there. And it ended up, in the end, working out for him. He was elected to the Senate from the state of Ohio. You need, again, I waited for the end. You need a code word here. I'll give you Hillbilly Elegy. I'm a little mad at J.D. Vance for becoming somebody who's not, but the book is actually pretty good and a pretty cool exploration of sort of social and economic mobilization in part of the country that a lot of people don't understand. So Hillbilly Elegy, use that as your code word. Check out the book if you want to. It's pretty good. So that's it on the legislature here. So for this point, we're going to talk next week about the judiciary. We'll talk about the presidency and the bureaucracy, and then I'll bring this into the midterm exam here. So hope you enjoyed this. It's Congress. Nobody likes it, but it's actually pretty important to our political system. And the cool thing is that it's dynamic. It's evolving over time, so we can sort of trace that change as well. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much.